Hi everyone, I wanted to show you a monster rabbit that I made. First of all, I took this old sock bunny I made a few years ago and I cut out a rough template in paper just to give me a rough idea of the size that I would need for the face. And then I took my epoxy sculpt and mixed that 50-50 as usual, because I wanted to use epoxy sculpt because it's a lot harder wearing than the air drying clay. And the air drying clay tends to have a bit of a powdery finish, and it is fragile, whereas the epoxy sculpt is quite tough. So what I did is I made a blob of epoxy sculpt and pressed it down with my finger and then inserted the glass bead that I was using for the eye. These are like those glass drops that like you can put in the bottom of a fish tank, or these are actually off an ornament that I've got. So I pinched two of those. I kind of wish I had painted behind them now, but it doesn't matter, never mind. So I stuck those into the clay and sculpted the eye sockets around them. This just made sure that they were well set into the clay, and we're going to hold in position as the epoxy sculpt dried. Then it was a case of making the eyelids. So I took a blob of epoxy sculpt, made it into a circle around about the same sort of size, and then cut it in half to make the eyelids. In hindsight, I should have put the bottom eyelids on first before the top, but never mind. Then I did the same again to create the bottom eyelid, and then put that on the eye. I wanted to give him quite a sort of scaly expression, and then I just used my clay tool to shape the eyelids, to get them how I wanted them, just to have them exactly how I wanted. And if you're wondering why I'm sculpting on paper, the epoxy sculpt kept sticking to my desk, and every time I took it off my desk it destroyed what I was sculpting. Whereas this way, all I had to do was wait till the epoxy sculpt was dry and remove the paper, and it did come off as well, by the way. So yeah, this was just so I could move it around on my desk and not have it all stuck to my desk, because for some reason on the vinyl it sticks really well, and I just could not remove it off my desk. I used the baby wipe to smooth down where I'd blended the edges of the epoxy sculpt in, but you'll see later on, you can see the bandage I've got on my wrist, because I sprained my wrist at the time, and I used a piece of that bandage to add texture afterwards, because part of the bandage I'd got on was touching the clay and I saw the texture it left, and it was quite a good sort of wrinkly texture which would be good for the monster skin, so I actually used a piece of that later on to add texture over the whole thing. Then once I was happy with the eyelids, it was a case of trimming around the eyes just to get rid of some of the bulk and just to refine the shape of them a little bit. And again, I used the baby wipe to smooth down the edges. Then it was just a case of testing just to make sure they weren't too big. Ideally I would have liked some slightly smaller glass drops, but that's all I had around the house. I then took another piece of paper so I could sculpt the rest of the face. I was going to do it all separately, and then I did join it together in the end because it's easier for when I sew it onto the bunny later. Sorry if you hear me sniffing, by the way, I've got really bad hay fever at the minute. So once the eyes were sorted, I mixed a second batch of epoxy sculpt. The reason I didn't mix up loads in the first place is because it does start to harden quite quickly, and obviously I didn't want to waste a load of epoxy sculpt because it's not the cheapest. So I mixed a second batch of epoxy sculpt, and I used this to create the nose and mouth for the monster bunny. The idea was, by the way, that I was going to have this up for Easter, but I didn't get a chance to actually finish this. And then I'm kind of working out how I want to do the mouth, how big I need to make it, what shape I want to make it. And I was going to do it sort of vertical first of all, so it's like a big sort of wide open mouth. But in the end I did it horizontal because it fits better onto the sock bunny. I will include a link in the description if I've got one on the video on how to make the sock bunny if you're curious, if you want to make one of these. So what I did is I created the lip shape first, and then created a piece of clay to go to the back of it to form the back of the mouth. And then it was just a case of blending all the edges in with my clay tool and adding any details that I wanted to add, like the teeth and stuff. At this point I'm just adding sort of like a gum line, and then this is the stage where I decided it would be better if I joined it all together, because otherwise when I come to sew it onto the bunny afterwards I'm going to have to do it all in sections and it'd be a pain. And then I started sculpting the teeth out of epoxy sculpt, as you can see. Originally I was going to do one row of teeth, and then I decided I think I placed one tooth in slightly the wrong place or something, and I thought, oh, it looks better with the 2 rows of teeth, and I ended up doing 2 rows of teeth on the bunny. Ideally what I would like to have done is painted the inside of the mouth black first before putting the teeth on, but to get the teeth to stick better and to stay in place a lot better, I needed to apply them directly onto the wet epoxy sculpt. Otherwise you have to glue them with super glue and stuff, and you can have them where they just keep falling off and stuff, so it was easier just to do it this way. And all I'm doing here is I'm pinching off a piece of the epoxy sculpt that I've mixed together, and then rolling it in between my fingers to make a very small sort of almost sausage shape, and then you squeeze the end to make it into a point, and that's how you create the teeth shapes. And then it's just a case of keep positioning those into the mouth and making sure you press them down firmly enough so that they stick to the epoxy sculpt mouth, but not too hard so you squish the teeth, because obviously at this stage they are quite delicate and easy to squish. This is the stage where I decided it'd be better if the teeth stuck outwards as opposed to actually just being quite flat. And then I'm just going around and smoothing around where the gum line is and making sure the teeth are blended in. Then I was deciding on the positioning of the eyes, and as you can see I sort of tilted them so that the inner corners were pointing down. It makes him look like he's a little bit more evil. And then it was a case of adding a bit of epoxy sculpt to fill up the gap and then create his nose. I wanted quite a sort of flat nose that was quite sort of far back in his head, with the 2 big nostrils sticking out. Then I added little tear ducts in the eyes, just using tiny little bits of the clay. And again, just smooth that all down with this little sculpting tool I've got. And it's at this stage that I decided it would be better to have 2 rows of teeth. So I decided to add a second row of ever so slightly smaller teeth than the first. First of all I was seeing what it looked like, and then once I decided I liked it I did it on the top set as well. I don't know, it just because of like I thought of like sharks and stuff and how they've got these rows of teeth, and I just thought that it would look a bit more, I don't know, scary, a bit more creepy if he'd got 2 rows of teeth. And then it was a case of trimming the paper around it and then just leaving the epoxy sculpt for 24 hours to set. And you can see here that I like the texture of the bandage, so I used a separate piece and used that to sculpt the texture of the flesh onto the monster's face. And you'll see shortly what I do is I add holes into either side of the eyes, inside the mouth and at the sides of the mouth, and that gives me the ability to sew it onto the bunny, because I thought at first I was going to glue it on, and then I was like, that's going to be a bit of a pain and it might not stick very well onto the fabric. So I decided what I was going to do was actually create holes in the sculpt where I could actually sew through with needle and thread, and that's what I went with in the end. And I put 2 holes in the centre of the mouth just so I could put some extra stabilising stitches through there just to make sure it stayed in place. And obviously because the whole thing was going to be painted later on, you wouldn't really see the stitches later. because they would be painted the same colour as the rest of the sculpt. After 24 hours, what I did, well, I say 24 hours, this was about 3 days later because I didn't get round to it. But yeah, after a minimum of 24 hours leaving the clay to dry, then it's time to sew it onto the bunny rabbit. And all I'm doing is just using some thread. I wasn't too bothered about the colour of the thread I was using. I just went with one that kind of matches the bunny in the end. And it's just a case of sewing through those holes and just do a couple of sort of stitches through and then tie it off a couple of times just to make sure it stays in place. You could, if you wanted to, add like a little spot of glue as well, like a bit of super glue or something behind it, just to give it that extra bit of sort of rigidity. But I found that this, once it was stitched, it did stay on really well actually. It feels quite secure. Another point as well is, which I found out later on, obviously I don't know why it didn't occur to me, but it did later. The weight of the clay on the front obviously is going to be a lot heavier than the back of the bunny, because the bunny's only made out of a sock and a bit of stuffing. So it is a good idea, if you want this to sit up without keep falling over, weight the bottom of it. So what you need to do is put like a little bag of rice or some beads or something in the bottom of the bunny rabbit, just to weigh down that the back side of the bunny rabbit. Otherwise you might find that it falls forward quite a lot. At least I found that with mine. So what I've got to do is put the weight in the butt of the rabbit. I mean, I can get it to sit up, but it does fall over really easy if I've only got so much as sneeze by it and it falls over. So make sure you do that, and it's a good idea to do that when you actually create the bunny. But never mind, like I said, I created these bunnies a couple of years ago, and obviously I didn't plan on sticking a load of clay on them at first. Then what I did once the face was sewn in place is painted the whole thing black first of all. This is just to sort of darken the clay, because the clay was too pale. And then you'll see later on that after I've painted the whole thing black, first of all I was going to put white over the top, but then it sort of just blended in. So I decided to actually just wipe off some of the black with a baby wipe, and that sort of gives it a sort of older, an older look, and it makes it so that the creases and texture of the clay stands out. As you can see, first of all I was applying a bit of white, and it just sort of blended in with the black. I mean, I could have done that if I'd have left the clay to dry, left the black to dry a bit longer, but never mind. So then what I did is I took a baby wipe and used that to wipe off the excess paint, and as you can see, I preferred that a lot better actually, because it made the wrinkles on the eyelids show up a lot better, apart from the one eye where I wiped too much off and had to put the paint back on. And I used that just to sort of make the features of the nose stand out a bit more, the texture of the lips stand out a bit more. And then once that baby wipe was covered in black paint, I used it to wipe over the whole bunny, to make it look all dirty and grimy, as if this has been sort of hanging around somewhere, some deep dark basement, waiting for victims and been catching things, like maybe it's been hiding in a cellar and it's been catching rats or birds or something, because it's only little, so maybe it just eats like small animals, and you know, chases small things. And then I touched up the teeth, because obviously I painted the mouth before with the teeth inserted obviously meant I got black paint everywhere, but that's fine. You just wait for the black paint to dry and then you can just touch it up with a bit of white paint. And then I used a very tiny brush just to go in between the teeth, any little areas I'd missed on the gum line that I wanted black, because having the black inside the mouth added more depth to the mouth. And that's it. That's how to make a monster bunny. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.